The lights backstage were low, the air thick with sweat, smoke, and the faint hum of amplifiers cooling down after a night that had shaken Chicago's walls. Somewhere beyond the curtain, thousands of voices still echoed Chuck Berry's name. But in a quiet dressing room, history was about to collide. One legend was about to challenge another, without knowing it. Michael Jackson stood there, young, electric, restless. Chuck Berry, the architect of rock and roll himself, held a guitar like a relic from another era. And in that moment, neither man realized they were standing at the edge of one of the most disciplined comebacks entertainment would ever witness. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. Chicago, March 1983. Backstage at a packed venue, Chuck Berry wiped sweat from his brow and leaned against a battered amp case. The man who taught the world how to move to a guitar riff had just finished another set that felt like muscle memory. His fingers still burned. His heart still raced. Rock and roll was still alive in his veins. Then Michael Jackson walked in. At that moment, Michael Jackson was already a global icon. Thriller had exploded across the planet. His face was everywhere. His voice had redefined pop. His dancing had rewritten the language of motion. But despite all of that, there was one thing he didn't have, at least not yet. A guitar. Michael Jackson had grown up surrounded by music, but not instruments in his hands. His instrument had always been his body, his voice, his instinct. He was rhythm incarnate. But now, standing in front of Chuck Berry, he felt something else stirring inside him, curiosity. A hunger not just to perform music, but to touch it, shape it, command it with his own hands. Chuck Berry noticed him immediately. The room shifted. Legends feel each other's gravity. Michael smiled, that shy but magnetic smile, and gestured toward the guitar in Chuck's hands. "Mind if I try?" Chuck Berry looked him up and down. Not with malice, not with disrespect, but with the quiet skepticism of a man who had seen stars rise and fall, trends come and go, fame burn bright and vanish. Without ceremony, he handed Michael the guitar. Michael Jackson held it like a sacred object. The wood felt heavier than he expected. The strings bit into his fingertips. He tried to place his fingers on the fretboard the way he'd seen musicians do it, but his hands didn't know where to go. He strummed. Nothing. Not silence, worse than silence. A dull, uneven scrape. No rhythm, no harmony, just noise. Michael tried again. Still nothing. Chuck Berry watched quietly for a moment, then laughed. Not cruel laughter, not mocking laughter, the laughter of a man who had earned the right to laugh. "Stick to dancing, kid," he said. "Leave this to the pros." The room froze. Michael Jackson smiled politely. He nodded. He handed the guitar back. But inside him something cracked. Not his confidence, his pride. For the first time in a long time, Michael Jackson had been publicly reminded, by one of the architects of modern music, that there was a part of music he didn't own. That night after the show, after the crowd, after the lights faded, Michael Jackson didn't sleep. He sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. The weight of the guitar. The sound of the failed strum. Chuck Berry's words. "Leave this to the pros." Michael Jackson was not the kind of man who accepted limits, not from critics, not from rivals, not from history, and certainly not from himself. The next morning, he did something no one saw coming. He bought a guitar. Not a showpiece, not a collector's item, a real working instrument. Then he bought another. Then he hired a teacher. Then another. And another. What followed was not glamorous, it wasn't televised, it wasn't celebrated, it was quiet, brutal, repetitive. Michael Jackson practiced. Not casually. Not occasionally. Obsessively. He practiced until his fingers blistered, then practiced through the pain. He practiced until the strings cut into his skin, then wrapped his fingers and practiced more. He practiced scales in the morning, chords in the afternoon, rhythm patterns at night. He practiced standing, sitting, walking. He practiced alone in hotel rooms, in studio corners, on tour buses, in dressing rooms. He practiced between dance rehearsals, between vocal sessions, between meetings. While others slept, Michael Jackson practiced. While others partied, Michael Jackson practiced. While others enjoyed the success Thriller had brought, Michael Jackson was chasing something else: mastery. But not mastery for the stage. Mastery for himself. Because the truth was, that moment with Chuck Berry had touched something deeper than ego. It had exposed a boundary in his own musical identity. And Michael Jackson did not tolerate boundaries. 6 months passed. 6 months of silence. No interviews. No headlines. No rumors. Just practice. Then quietly, Michael Jackson arranged to return to Chicago. Not for a show. Not for publicity. Not for revenge. For one reason only. Chuck Berry. Backstage march again. Same city. Different energy. Chuck Berry sat in his chair, tuning his guitar. The room smelled of coffee and amplifier dust. The walls were covered with old posters, faded photographs of nights long past. Then the door opened. Michael Jackson stepped in. Chuck looked up surprised. "Well, look who it is." Michael smiled. "Mind if I try again?" Chuck raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Michael nodded. Chuck Berry handed him the guitar. The same weight. The same strings. The same room. But not the same man. Michael Jackson adjusted the strap, settled the guitar against his body, and without hesitation, placed his fingers on the fretboard. Then he played. Not perfectly. Not like a seasoned blues veteran. But cleanly. Confidently. Deliberately. A chord rang out. Then another. Then a progression. Then rhythm. Chuck Berry stopped tuning. He leaned forward. Michael Jackson kept playing. He moved from chords to a simple riff. Not flashy. Not fast. But controlled. Intentional. Alive. The room shifted again. Not with laughter. With silence. The kind of silence that only exists when something unexpected is happening. Chuck Berry watched. His face changed, not to shock, not to disbelief, but to recognition. This wasn't talent. This was work. This was discipline. This was respect. Michael Jackson finished the phrase and looked up. Chuck Berry didn't speak. He just smiled. Then he laughed, but this time differently. "All right," he said, "all right." He took the guitar back and nodded. "You've been busy." Michael Jackson smiled, the kind of smile that comes from quiet victory, not public applause. That moment never made headlines. There were no cameras, no press releases, no viral clips. But in the private world of musicians, it became legend. Not because Michael Jackson became a great guitarist, but because he refused to stay only what the world expected him to be. Michael Jackson had already conquered the stage, the charts, the dance floor, and the cultural imagination. But what this moment revealed was something deeper. He wasn't satisfied with being the best at what he already did. He wanted to become more. And not because the audience demanded it. Because his soul did. This wasn't about proving Chuck Berry wrong. It was about proving himself right. In the months and years that followed, Michael Jackson didn't suddenly start performing guitar solos on stage. He didn't brand himself as a multi-instrumentalist. He didn't advertise his new skill. But behind the scenes, something had changed. His songwriting became more rhythmically layered. His arrangements became more instrumentally complex. His ear became sharper. His musical instincts expanded beyond melody and beat into structure, harmony and texture. Michael Jackson wasn't just hearing music anymore. He was touching it, feeling its architecture, understanding its mechanics. This wasn't about ego. It was about respect for music, for musicians, and for the craft itself. And perhaps most importantly, it was about humility. Because Michael Jackson could have dismissed Chuck Berry's words. He could have said, "I'm already the king of pop. I don't need to prove anything." But he didn't. He chose to listen, to learn, to become a student again. That is what separates stars from legends. Legends never stop learning. Behind the glitter, behind the fame, behind the perfection, Michael Jackson was still a worker, a student, a craftsman. And that discipline, the discipline to be bad at something, to struggle, to fail, and to continue anyway, was the same discipline that had driven him from a child prodigy to a global icon. The guitar was just another chapter in the same story. A story about refusing to accept limits, about refusing to be boxed in by expectation, about refusing to believe that success means stopping. Chuck Berry never publicly talked much about that moment. Michael Jackson never did either. But those who were there remembered. They remembered the first strum, the laughter, the silence, the second strum, the nod, and the quiet respect exchanged between two generations of musical royalty. Because what Michael Jackson proved wasn't that he could outplay Chuck Berry. He proved that he could outwork his own comfort. He proved that he could be humble enough to start at zero. He proved that mastery is not a destination, it's a decision made every day. And that is the real lesson of that Chicago dressing room. Not that Michael Jackson learned guitar, but that Michael Jackson never stopped becoming. In a world that often celebrates talent, this story celebrates discipline. In a world obsessed with perfection, this story honors imperfection. In a culture addicted to instant success, this story reminds us that the greatest comebacks often happen in silence. Because while the world was applauding Michael Jackson for his moonwalks, his vocals, his charts, and his records, he was alone in a room, struggling with a guitar, one chord at a time. And that struggle didn't make him less legendary. It made him more human. And in that humanity, more powerful. So the next time you watch Michael Jackson glide across a stage, remember this. Behind every effortless move was endless effort. Behind every perfect note was countless imperfect ones. Behind every triumph was a moment when someone laughed, and he chose to listen. And that perhaps is the greatest music Michael Jackson ever made. Dan, just when you think that story ends in that quiet Chicago dressing room, it doesn't. Because what happened next didn't just reshape Michael Jackson's relationship with music. It reshaped the way he saw himself, the way he built his art, and the way the world would feel his work for decades to come. The guitar became more than an instrument. It became a symbol, a reminder, a private oath. From that day forward, Michael Jackson no longer saw music as something that simply passed through him. He saw it as something he could construct, dismantle, rebuild, and perfect. The sound no longer floated around him. It lived in his hands, his mind, his discipline. And quietly, almost invisibly, it began to change everything. Back in Los Angeles, Michael Jackson returned to Westlake Recording Studios with a new energy. The walls of Studio D, which had already witnessed the birth of Thriller, were now about to witness something else, transformation, not of sound, but of mindset. Producers noticed it first. There was a difference in the way Michael listened. Before, he listened emotionally, responding to how a beat felt, how a melody moved his body. Now he listened structurally, how chords stacked, how rhythms locked, how instruments spoke to each other in conversation. He wasn't just reacting to music anymore. He was interrogating it. Can we try that in a different key? What if the bass walks instead of holds? Can we strip that down and rebuild it? Engineers looked at each other. This wasn't the same Michael Jackson. This was a composer in evolution. And it all traced back to a moment when he couldn't play a single note. Michael Jackson's perfectionism had always been legendary, but now it was surgical, precise, methodical. Where he once chased emotional perfection, he now chased mechanical precision. Where he once relied on instinct, he now built systems. And slowly, invisibly, this new discipline began to seep into every corner of his work. His vocal phrasing changed. He began to think of his voice not just as a lead, but as an instrument among instruments, one that could weave, clash, harmonize, or disappear when needed. His demos became more intricate. Instead of simple beatboxing and humming melodies, he began layering ideas, mock bass lines, rhythm guitar patterns, harmonic structures. He didn't just bring songs to producers anymore. He brought blueprints. Michael Jackson had always heard entire songs in his head, but now he heard the scaffolding too. And that changed everything. People close to him began to notice something else as well. He was quieter. Not withdrawn. Focused. Where he once spoke in bursts of energy, now he listened longer, thought deeper, paused before answering. He had entered a new phase of his artistry, the phase where mastery becomes invisible because it's internal. And this transformation didn't happen because he wanted to prove Chuck Berry wrong. It happened because he wanted to prove something to himself. That he could grow, that he could learn, that he could fail and not be broken by it, that he could walk into a room, be humbled and walk out stronger. And that mindset didn't stay in music. It infected everything. His dancing became more anatomically precise. His choreography more architecturally complex. His stage designs more structurally ambitious. Even his business decisions became more calculated, more layered, more strategic. Michael Jackson wasn't just an artist anymore. He was an engineer of experience. But there was another shift happening beneath the surface, one that few people saw and even fewer understood. The guitar didn't just give him technical skill. It gave him vulnerability. Because learning an instrument meant becoming a beginner again. It meant being bad at something. It meant asking questions. It meant accepting correction. And for someone who had been on stage since the age of 5, who had spent his entire life being told he was extraordinary, this was revolutionary. Michael Jackson had entered a space where he was ordinary. And instead of running from that, he leaned into it. He became a student again. And that student mindset became the quiet engine behind some of the most emotionally complex, sonically ambitious, and structurally daring music of his career. When he began work on Bad, that shift became unmistakable. The sessions were different. The energy was different. The expectations were different. This wasn't Thriller Part II. This was something else. Michael Jackson didn't want to repeat himself. He wanted to outgrow himself. He walked into those sessions not as a pop star chasing hits, but as a craftsman chasing mastery. He challenged Quincy Jones more. He challenged himself more. He challenged the music more. And the music fought back. Tracks were built and torn apart. Songs were rewritten dozens of times. Arrangements were scrapped and rebuilt. Harmonies were rethought. Rhythms were restructured. Michael Jackson pushed not just for emotional impact, but for musical integrity. He wasn't satisfied with songs that worked. He wanted songs that endured. And that required discipline. Not the flashy discipline of performance, but the quiet discipline of patience, of listening, of revision, of humility. And that discipline traced back to a single moment of failure in front of Chuck Berry. But the story doesn't stop there. Because 6 months after that Chicago moment, Michael Jackson didn't just walk away with a new skill. He walked away with a new lens. A lens through which he began to see music not as fame, not as charts, not as applause, but as legacy. And that lens would define everything that came next. In the late nights of Westlake Studios, Michael Jackson would sit alone, guitar resting against his knee, softly picking strings, not to write songs, not to perform, but simply to feel the vibration of sound through wood and wire. He was learning the language of instruments, not to speak it fluently, but to understand it. And understanding is power. Because once you understand how something works, you are no longer at its mercy. You can shape it, transform it, transcend it. This was the moment Michael Jackson stopped being just a performer. He became an architect. And architects don't just build structures. They design worlds. Worlds of sound. Worlds of emotion. Worlds of memory. Worlds that people carry with them long after the music stops. This shift became painfully clear during one specific session. Michael Jackson was working on a track that wasn't flowing. The beat felt right. The melody felt strong. But something was missing. The song felt flat. Incomplete. Most artists would have moved on. Michael Jackson didn't. He sat in silence for nearly an hour. Not speaking. Not singing. Not moving. Just listening. To the track. To the room. To his own thoughts. Then he picked up the guitar. Not to play it. To hold it. To feel its weight. To remember what it felt like to not know. To struggle. To learn. He closed his eyes. And then he spoke. The space between the notes needs to breathe. The room went quiet. The engineers looked confused. What do you mean? Michael Jackson stood up and walked to the console. He pointed to a section of the track. Right there, he said, that's where the song needs air. They stripped the section down. Removed layers. Simplified the rhythm. Let the silence speak. And suddenly the song transformed. Not louder. Not faster. Not bigger. But deeper. More emotional. More human. This was not instinct. This was understanding. Understanding that music is not just sound. It is space. It is tension. It is release. It is breath. It is architecture. Michael Jackson had learned to see music in 3 dimensions. And that vision reshaped everything. His collaborators began to realize something unsettling. They weren't just working with a star. They were working with a mind that never stopped evolving. A mind that refused to rest on success. A mind that treated failure not as a verdict, but as data. Michael Jackson wasn't afraid to fail. He was afraid to stagnate. And that fear drove him harder than any critic ever could. But this transformation didn't come without cost. The more Michael Jackson learned, the more he felt the weight of responsibility. Not just to his audience, but to music itself. He began to see his platform not just as a stage, but as a trust. A trust to honor the past, to elevate the present, to shape the future. And that sense of responsibility changed the way he viewed other musicians. He no longer saw himself as separate from instrumentalists. He saw himself as part of them. part of a lineage, part of a tradition, part of a craft. This deepened his respect for jazz musicians, for blues artists, for session players, for orchestral composers, for producers, for engineers, for anyone who dedicated their life to sound. Michael Jackson didn't just want to be admired by fans. He wanted to be respected by musicians. And respect is not earned through fame. It's earned through discipline, through humility, through mastery. This shift also changed how he approached collaboration. He no longer entered rooms as the star who needed to be impressed. He entered as the student who wanted to learn. He asked questions. He listened. He absorbed. He observed. And when he spoke, it was with intention. Not dominance. Not ego. Purpose. This made him a different kind of leader. Not a dictator. Not a diva. But a visionary. A visionary who understood that the best ideas often come from listening, not speaking. That humility is not weakness. It is intelligence. And that learning never ends. But perhaps the most profound impact of that Chicago moment wasn't musical. It was personal. Because learning the guitar forced Michael Jackson to confront something he had avoided his entire life. Struggle. As a child prodigy, he had been exceptional from the beginning. As a teenager, he had been extraordinary. As an adult, he had been unmatched. He had rarely been in situations where he was not the best in the room. And that isolation, while glamorous, was dangerous. Because greatness without struggle becomes fragile. But greatness forged through struggle becomes unbreakable. The guitar humbled him. It forced him into vulnerability. It forced him to admit ignorance. It forced him to accept guidance. And in doing so, it gave him something no award ever could. Perspective. Perspective on how hard music truly is. Perspective on how much effort others put in behind the scenes. Perspective on how much respect the craft deserves. This perspective softened him. Not weakened him. Softened him. Made him kinder. More patient. More empathetic. He began to treat everyone in the studio differently. From engineers to assistants to musicians. Not as subordinates, but as collaborators. As craftsmen. As equals. Because he now understood something he hadn't before. Everyone in that room was struggling. Everyone was learning. Everyone was chasing mastery. And that shared struggle created something powerful. Connection. Michael Jackson had always connected with audiences. But now, he connected with creators. And that changed the energy of his workspaces. They became less about pressure. More about process. Less about performance. More about creation. Less about results. More about growth. And from that environment, some of the most ambitious, emotionally layered, and musically complex work of his career emerged. But this wasn't the end of his transformation. It was the beginning. Because once you realize that growth is possible, you begin to crave it. And Michael Jackson did not just crave growth. He pursued it relentlessly. He began studying music theory. Not casually. Seriously. He asked questions about chord progressions, about key changes, about modes, about harmony, about rhythm theory. He wanted to understand why certain progressions felt emotional, why certain rhythms felt urgent, why certain melodies felt timeless. He wanted to understand the mathematics of emotion, the architecture of feeling, the science of soul. This wasn't academic curiosity. This was artistic necessity. Because Michael Jackson didn't just want to make music. He wanted to design experiences. Experiences that moved people emotionally, physically, spiritually. Experiences that transcended language, culture, age, and time. And to do that, he needed to understand music at its deepest level. Not just as sound, but as psychology, as physics, as emotion, as memory. This hunger for understanding led him to explore genres he had previously admired from a distance. Jazz, blues, classical, world music. He didn't just listen. He studied. He analyzed. He deconstructed. He absorbed. He didn't try to imitate these genres. He tried to understand them. And then, quietly, he began to integrate their principles into his own work. Not overtly, not obviously, but subtly, in the phrasing, in the rhythm, in the harmony, in the structure, in the emotional arc. Michael Jackson's music began to feel deeper, more layered, more textured, more dimensional. Not because it became more complex, but because it became more intentional. Every sound had a purpose. Every silence had a meaning. Every beat had a reason. Every note had a role. This was not accident. This was design. This was discipline. This was mastery in motion. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Michael Jackson's transformation is that he never advertised it. He never gave interviews about learning guitar. He never framed it as a comeback. He never told the story publicly. He let the work speak. And the work did speak. Not in words, in feeling, in connection, in resonance, in endurance. Decades later, people still feel his music. Not just hear it, feel it, in their bones, in their hearts, in their memories. That is not coincidence. That is craft. And that craft was sharpened by a moment of humility. A moment when a legend laughed. A moment when Michael Jackson failed. A moment when he chose to grow. But there is one more layer to this story. One more revelation. One more transformation. Because Michael Jackson's relationship with the guitar did not just change his music. It changed his relationship with himself. Learning an instrument gave him something he had never truly experienced. Control. Not control over others. Control over his own expression. He no longer felt dependent on producers to translate his ideas. He could now communicate them more precisely. He could demonstrate. He could illustrate. He could articulate. This gave him confidence. Not the confidence of fame. The confidence of competence. And competence changes everything. It shifts your posture, your voice, your presence, your decision-making, your boundaries, your standards. Michael Jackson became more assertive in creative discussions. Not aggressive, not arrogant, but firm, because he knew what he wanted, and he knew how to achieve it. This didn't create conflict. It created clarity. People knew where he stood. People knew what he expected. People knew the standard. And that clarity elevated everyone around him. Because clarity is leadership. And leadership is responsibility. Michael Jackson didn't want to just be a performer. He wanted to be a steward of music, a guardian of quality, a protector of craft. And that stewardship began with himself, with his own growth, with his own humility, with his own discipline. But this story is not just about Michael Jackson. It's about something larger, something universal, something human. It's about what happens when someone who already has everything chooses to become a beginner again. It's about what happens when someone who has reached the top chooses to climb higher. Not for fame, not for money, not for validation, but for meaning, for growth, for truth, for mastery. This story challenges the myth of natural talent, because Michael Jackson was undeniably talented. But talent did not make him great. Discipline did. Humility did. Curiosity did. Persistence did. And above all, the willingness to be uncomfortable did. Because growth does not happen in comfort. It happens in struggle, in failure, in vulnerability, in humility, in patience, in persistence. Michael Jackson embraced all of that. Quietly, relentlessly, without applause, without validation, without recognition. And that is why his legacy endures. Not because he was perfect, but because he never stopped becoming. And that is the real message of this story. Not that Chuck Berry doubted him. Not that Michael Jackson proved him wrong. But that Michael Jackson refused to stay the same. In a world obsessed with identity, he chose evolution. In a culture addicted to success, he chose growth. In an industry built on image, he chose substance. And that choice changed everything. Because every song he recorded after that moment carried a deeper layer of intention. Every performance carried a deeper layer of meaning. Every movement carried a deeper layer of purpose. Every silence carried a deeper layer of power. Michael Jackson didn't just perform music. He inhabited it. He engineered it. He embodied it. And that embodiment began with a single failed strum. A single laugh. A single decision. To not walk away. To not dismiss. To not deny. But to learn. To grow. To become. So when you hear Michael Jackson's music, you're not just hearing sound. You're hearing discipline. You're hearing humility. You're hearing struggle. You're hearing growth. You're hearing evolution. You're hearing the echo of a Chicago dressing room where a legend laughed and another legend listened. And in that listening changed forever. Because true greatness is not measured by how high you rise. It's measured by how willing you are to start again. To begin again. To become again. Michael Jackson did. And the world is still feeling the vibration of that choice. If this story resonated with you, inspired you, or reminded you that it's never too late to begin again, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that history almost forgot.